Hello. Welcome to my show. My name is Bret. I am here live every Thursday. If this is not your first time, thank you so much for coming back. It means a lot to me. If this is your first time watching live or maybe after, we do this every Thursday. I usually have guests, and then around once a month, I do this, which is Q&A. It's just you and me. I'm dispensing any knowledge I might have or guesses I might have on what the right answer is. And then we have people in chat, you wonderful people in chat that are answering questions as well. So no question is a bad question when it comes to DevOps, containers, any cloud native stuff. Those are all topics. Of course, there's a lot of students coming here from my courses. We recently this year hit 300,000 students in the courses. That's very exciting. So if you're taking those courses, welcome. Glad you're here. If you have course questions, bring them as well. And I just try to take them in order. So as they show up in the chat, I try to answer them that way. And of course, if we go 15, 20 minutes and the chat scrolled up and there's a lot of chat going on, I might miss your question. So feel free to ask it again. I do mark the questions as they come in so that I hopefully get them in order. And as the chat scrolls, I can actually see which ones I've answered. And there we go. That's the rules. So in case you didn't know about this channel, it's member sponsored. So we're not yet using YouTube membership. So let me know if that's something you'd rather do. But what I do is Patreon. So over on Patreon, you can get me at patreon.com/Bret Fisher, link below. And the sponsors of that show sponsor this, the podcast that comes out of it that releases every other Friday, the open source and the continual growth of my ridiculous amounts of repos on GitHub with all the examples for a lot of this container stuff. And of course, the Discord server. So if you didn't know about Discord, you can get it up here. We used to have a Slack channel. We still have a Slack team or work group or whatever the latest name is. But that's not really the focus anymore. All of the focus for stuff after the courses and for really the courses as well is all over on Discord. For some reason, the community really stuck with Discord, so now we have over 100,000 people over there. 100,000. I said 100,000. I meant 10,000. 100,000 would be amazing, but 10,000 in that Discord server. So thank you, though, for, if you're on there, for hanging out. And there's always chat all day long, every day. In case you didn't know, by the way, we are now doing events on Patreon. So when you jump on the free Patreon server, it's devops.fan. There's now a list of events, including what's going to be on this weekly show, what the next High Fivers is going to be. Let me talk about that real quick. High Fivers is on Patreon. By the way, you don't have to pay me on Patreon. You can just click the follow button and you get my weekly emails about all the stuff that's being created by me and my team. And if you'd like to give a little bit money per month, like a coffee essentially, and buy me a coffee, the High Fivers group, you get some exclusive benefits, including access to areas of Discord and a monthly Discord hangout. So this just happened yesterday, and I'm going to talk about it because it was a lot of fun yesterday. We had a group of people, 5 to 7 usually show up, and we hang out and just talk about the projects we're working on, talk about the infrastructure as code we're making or the problems we're having with our projects, or maybe something new we learned recently. Sometimes people actually bring code or infrastructure as code and we review it. And yesterday we talked a lot about careers, the different ways that we've had to evolve our learning over the last 20, 30 years. I've been doing this almost 30 years now, and the way we have to learn and the way we have to hire has changed a lot. And that affects how you get a job. And we talked a lot about that yesterday. We had some great insight from some people there. I think we had Payam on, Kevin, Brandon, John, a few newcomers. It was a great time. So that happens once a month, and you get that as part of the High Fivers Patreon. And you just automatically get added into the Discord server rooms once you link your Discord. So if you're interested in that, again, High Fivers right over here. That'll get you that access. We're trying to improve that hangout and see, it usually lasts an hour, but this time it went an hour and a half, so you never really know. And we had some fun. So hopefully you'll check that out. All right, enough with the sales pitches. Of course, all the course coupons are below and everything else that I make. But let's get to what your questions are. So bring me your topics. What do you care about this week? to start it off, I have been focusing on a workshop series I've been giving recently, not in public. It's for a private organization. But one of the things that I've been reviewing with them is essentially in Kubernetes, you can kind of do anything you want when you first build a Kubernetes cluster, right? You can make YAML for your pod spec inside of a deployment, and you can just go with it. But there's a bunch of things that you need to add in there that are really sort of the best practices, including resources, right, which is really important but often overlooked, the resource reservations, the resource limits, your health checks, your probes, making sure that the user and group you use in the container, because you don't want to run as root, ideally, if you don't have to run your app as root, and you usually don't, you don't do that. So you change all that stuff, you set it to where it can't use elevated privileges, that it can't use privilege mode, you lock it down, you do all that stuff, and then you have a app ready for production. And I've been focusing on that with them over the last few weeks on what that really means for developers, and what parts are a developer's responsibility and what parts are the ops responsibility, or something more traditional for ops. But you have these admission controllers now, and something that's happening next month is the 1.25 should be shipping next month with Kubernetes, and we're going to lose a feature, the PSPs, the pod security policies. Those have been around since the beginning of Kubernetes, and a lot of people use them. In fact, you should have been using them. And they're a relatively easy way to put some limits around what the developers can do on a cluster if you're the cluster admin. The PSPs were normally an admin or security team requirement if you had to use them. Well, now that those are gone, we have a bunch of other options. I think 4 that I can think of, 4 options that we have that include third-party stuff and now new built-in stuff like PSA. And I think it's pod security admission is the new thing. But it's quite different than what the old thing was, and it's not very flexible. So on this show earlier this year, we had Kyverno, a third-party tool that is now my favorite, at least to get started with. It is the easiest to get started with. It is YAML only. And in case you didn't know, kyverno.io. So this is strictly about admission policies, things that will be a gate in your Kubernetes cluster to help make sure that anyone deploying new apps to your cluster adheres to your standards. And you should have some. Even on the smallest clusters, you should have some basic ones. Basic ones like don't run as root unless you absolutely have to. Or setting some nice reservations and limits that aren't too strict, right? That at least give you some control. Because the reality is Kubernetes decides where to put your apps based on those reservations. And if you don't put any reservations or limits in, it doesn't know where to put it. So it'll just put it somewhere. And it might put it somewhere that it doesn't have enough resources to run, and it will crash. So you need to do that stuff. Well, Kyverno is one of those tools. There's Gatekeeper with OPA. There's another one called KubeWarden, I think, which uses WASM as the backend policy maker. Gatekeeper with OPA uses a different language as the backend policy maker. But I like Kyverno because Kyverno is just YAML. It's easy to get started. It's maybe not the most complete advanced solution for super big advanced teams, but it will get, I think, most people what they need. And it's free out of the box. They actually offer a paid version, which, again, was on the show, called Nirmata, earlier this year. You just look up Kyverno in this channel if you're interested in that. But that's been a focus this week, so I just wanted to talk about it, share that news with you, that if you're using PSPs, you're going to have to change that pretty soon, once you get to 125. If anyone has more questions about that, I'm happy to take those questions as well. So without having any questions in the chat, let me show off a little bit of what I'm talking about. Let's see if I can pull up a sample. I'm not ready for this per se, but let's see, code. We get in here. So I might have done this, I don't know, sometime in the recent history on here. We might have talked about seccomp and some other things. But if I was to create a minimal pod spec, And pod specs are the simplest thing you can do in Kubernetes. So maybe we're not all super advanced yet. Maybe we don't all have the most advanced setup. But pod specs are in everything, right? If you're going to do anything that creates a container, you're going to have some form of pod spec in it. And so that's the first thing you probably should learn when you're learning the YAML of Kubernetes. It's the first thing I teach. When we start learning how to do YAML in Kubernetes, I focus on the pod spec because that's where all of the details end up being. The stuff that you put on top of that for like deployments and daemon sets and stuff like that, it's just a little bit extra. But most of it's really in the pod spec, especially if you have multiple containers or you have maybe volumes, persistent volumes that you need to create, or a bunch of different environment variables. That all ends up in the pod spec. So let's look at something. Let's see if I can't share my screen here. Not that screen. Let's share some code. So here's VS Code, my favorite editor. And I've got a sample little pod spec in here. I'll zoom in a bit. And so if you look at this one, it doesn't have much in it. It's a very basic one. It does have this, which is probably something that your security team or ops team will require of you to put in your pod specs. In fact, they may be putting in admission controllers to mutate or augment your Kubernetes when you deploy your YAML. It may add this stuff by default. And so, especially if you work in a enterprise or a financial industry or government or something like that where security is of an even higher concern, you're definitely going to have something like this. And you're probably going to have something else called privileged, and you're probably going to have to set that to privileged false. And then you're probably going to have to come up here and add some other stuff that's for the actual pod, not just for each container, because those two security context settings are for the container. But you'll also maybe do something like this, where I'm a big fan of doing this for everything. And in fact, in the coming versions of Kubernetes, you'll be able to enable seccomp by default. And before I get to questions, Abdul, I'm over there with the question. I see that. I'll get to that in a second. Hello, everyone, by the way, from Portugal, India, Istanbul, Brazil, Netherlands. We've got people from all over, the U.S. included. At least I'm thinking that Donald is from the U.S. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, hello, everyone there. And getting back to this, the security context can be done at the pod and the container level, but we want to enable seccomp. Seccomp is one of 4 major security features in Linux that are optional for containers that we really should be considering. Another one of those is Linux capabilities. And by adding privileged down here at the bottom, privileged false, I'm making sure that I'm not using any of the high-end sudo root type of privileges. And then the allow privilege escalation means that my pod, or my container in this case, will not be able to get more privileges than after it starts. Essentially, it'll keep it restricted. So those to me are table stakes. Those are things that I should be putting in every pod by default. And unfortunately, unlike Docker, which enables all these things by default, Kubernetes does not. Kubernetes has a stance of, you should know what you're doing, your operators should know what they're doing, and they should enable these things for you. Well, I wish it was a little bit harder by default, but Kubernetes kept it all open, which to me means less secure by default. But if in Docker, by the way, to turn this on, you would have seccomp. If you just did Docker run, seccomp, AppArmor, SE Linux, Linux capabilities, these would all be things that would be enabled in some fashion. In Kubernetes, not so much. So we need to turn on seccomp. It's one of the better ones that has a default policy defined by your container runtime. It just happens to not be turned on. So why not turn it on for all of your workloads? And then, do some basic testing. Obviously, you're going to want to test to make sure it doesn't break anything. My experience is it's never broken any of my apps. I mean, I've run all sorts of stuff with all sorts of teams, .NET, Node.js, Java, Python, Ruby, MySQL, all these things, and I've never had a problem with seccomp profile, at least a default one. You can always create your own custom ones, but that's pretty advanced. You got to really know what you're doing there. So it's just better to disable. I think the default runtime one disables 44 different system calls that are normally there. That's like 300 plus system calls, I think, that seccomp can control. And it disables a lot of them just because Docker did the effort like 5, 7, 10, I don't know what it was, 8, 9, 10 years ago. When they first were creating Docker, they created a default seccomp profile that is now shipped with both Docker and Containerd, and we can enable that here. In future versions of Kubernetes, we will be able to enable that by default cluster-wide, and I will, once that happens, I will insist that all clusters have it, at least for the people I'm working with. So now we've got preventing privilege escalation, preventing or enabling seccomp to prevent some of the system calls. And then we can go further. We can add resource limits and reservations. We should do that here. We should add the user and group we're wanting to run at. That's optional, but I really like to define it in here so that Kubernetes knows exactly how to run my app. And even if my container app Docker file were to change, the policy going into production would be enforced. Even if the Docker file changed to running as root, it would force it to run as non-root in production and prevent the risk in production of my app accidentally being root. All right, let's see if we got any questions. I know that's a deep technical dive right there, but that was something that I've been working on lately, sort of defining default pod spec requirements for what I recommend. And yeah, so I was working on that. Let me know if you have questions about that or thoughts or opinions. So self-study with Abdul says, can you please explain about pod looping back and failing every time? May I know the reasons depends upon. I'm not sure what you're asking. Explain about pod looping back and failing every time. I'm not sure what that means. If maybe you could describe it a little bit more. Are you talking about the local host? When you say loop back, are you talking about localhost? I'm not sure what you're asking there. So maybe ask it a different way. Paolo's asking, but for use this, the container can't run with root user, right? Yes. So almost none of your apps need to actually run as root. But it turns out in Docker, all of our programming languages, like the official Node container, the official Ruby container, the official Python container, all of those by default run as root. Some of them will come built in with a non-root user, but they don't run that by default because that's your job. They want to use it. They want to create it for you for ease of use, not secure use. Docker by default, when it comes to images, and a lot of those images on Docker Hub, they're not designed for hardened production workloads. They're designed for ease of use. You get into this, if you were to come back a few weeks earlier, I did a DockerCon talk this year where I talked about default programming language container images on Docker Hub and how they're full of vulnerabilities. So you need to make better choices for your apps to make sure that you're not shipping a bunch of vulnerabilities into production, you're not running as root, and all those things. And I talk a lot about those in my courses. There are videos in Docker Mastery about it, but I'm welcome to entertain any of those questions today in case you have them related to that. But yeah, so when you're in that policy, when you do these two or one of them, this one, if you do one of these two right here, if your app tries to run as root, it won't work. Or if it tries to sudo inside the container, it won't work. It will prevent it. So in a separate section up here, you would define the user and the group that underneath the security context that you would run as. And you define that by the ID. Now, if you're using something like the Node container, the Node.js default container, it actually comes with a Node user built in. You don't even have to make it. You just have to type it in here in order to use that user, or put it in your Docker image. You put in user and then the username or user ID that you're going to use, and it will run it as a non-root user. Now, you do have to remember that you're going to have to probably change file permissions, other things like that. But if you're curious, I go through all of that in my DockerCon talk from this year. I've actually done it several times over the years. But if you go look at, I'll give you the URL. GitHub, let's see. So this talk was about Node.js, but it's not that Node.js specific. You could take those lessons and apply it to any other programming language. But there's a video link in there, and then there's tons of written documentation. So I'll recommend that you watch that and you can learn about base images, running as non-root, how to lock down or make your own custom images that are more secure. There's a lot of stuff in there. So I recommend that if you have questions. All right. Let's see. What's the next question? Can we create a pod security policy which can allow the creation of pods in the namespace whose containers are executed with a non-root user and in non-privileged mode? So pod security policy is going away. So I don't even think we should talk about it, because next month it won't even be in Kubernetes anymore in 125, which should ship next month. But we won't have PSPs. So maybe you should be asking about pod security admission controllers, PSA. And that comes with PSS, which is 3 different default policies that you can apply to namespaces. And so maybe the question should be, can you prevent non-root user and in a non-privileged mode? So can you add those restrictions? Yes. So if we look up Kubernetes and we look up pod security admission, I just Googled it basically. This is what is now in beta. It was previously in alpha. Now it's currently in beta as of 123. And of course, we're currently in 124. And when 125 comes out, the old PSPs will go away and PSAs will be the only thing available. My hope is that in 125, when PSPs go away, that this goes from beta to stable or general release. And I feel like the betas are typically pretty stable, and betas are enabled by default, so you can use this today if you're on 123 or newer. And you can see here the PSP is being removed in 120. It's already deprecated and will be removed in 125. So in here you get 3 different levels, and so the levels start at allow everything, which is essentially default, and then basic, and we can see let's see where we go. Yes, the pod security standard. So we have baseline, not basic. Baseline, which allows some things but disables other things, and then restricted. Now, to me, restricted is the goal of most apps. Most apps will not need anything from baseline, but it takes practice. It takes testing. So you can enable restricted on a namespace and then run all your apps in there, and it will warn you, and it'll talk about what doesn't work. It'll warn you when you even try to apply it to a namespace. It'll warn you about existing workloads, whether or not they would have problems if under this restricted policy. Because if you remember from your teachings, if it's my course or others, admission policies, which I don't yet talk about in my courses, admission policies only execute or only behave or only restrict when you're shipping new versions of resources. So when you apply this, it's not going to restrict anything that's currently running. It's not going to kill something. But when you then go and update and deploy new pods, that's when it will do its checks and it will reject anything that doesn't meet the policy. Restricted isn't actually that bad. I find that restricted really works fine on most programming languages, as long as you're not running as root, as long as you're not trying to bind mount host files, which is a anti-pattern. You should not do that. You should only use volumes or persistent volume claims, which go to persistent volumes. But you can do all those things inside the restricted, but it just doesn't allow a lot of the unnecessary administrative stuff that we probably don't need anyway. So great question. Thank you. Yeah. So thanks for trying to help Abdul out. Yeah, my development. Yeah, we're talking all about the crash loop backoff. So a lot of things, there's a lot of backoff algorithms in Kubernetes for when things fail. Crash loop is one of them. Image pull backoff is another one. And if you aren't using third-party tools, there's one called Comodoro, Argo CD, the actual deployment solution. All these different tools will have easier ways for you to visualize, with colors and other things. But if you're only at the command line, the describe command and the events command, and essentially using watch by doing something like, kube control get pods and watch them come up and down, or you can use events to see exactly what's happening in the background. You can use a -w in your commands, and the -w is like a wait. It will sit there and watch or wait for new pod changes. So you can do a kube control get pods -w, and it will just sit there, and you can watch any new events happening with pods. Is a pod starting? Is it deleting? Is it getting killed? What's going on there? It's not going to tell you why, but you can at least see if things are changing on the fly. Sometimes it's just not easy to see what's happening right now, what's changing right now. And then the describe command sums all that up, right? If you use kube control describe and then the pod, it will sum up what's happening with that pod. When was the last time it was restarted? How many times is it restarted? You can see the events. And so from there, you can maybe start looking at pod logs. The first issue that people often will have is they forget to authenticate for their private images. So they'll get the image pull back off. That's probably the first most common one, is the image pull back off, which simply means I can't get the image for some reason. Either you've named the image wrong in my pod spec, so I can't find it, or I don't have the authentication for it. And you might be able to jump into kube control events to see some of that. Again, things like Argo, maybe the Kubernetes dashboard, Komodoro, which is specifically a troubleshooting tool for Kubernetes. These are things, and there's, I'm sure, plenty other ones that will maybe give you easier visualizations and access to some of the things around what's not going correct. There's not really like an errors command that shows you all of the errors or problems in your cluster, right? Unfortunately. So once you've determined that, you've got the image coming down because you've properly added your Docker secret for the registry, you've done that. Now it's pulling the image, but now the image is crashing. So a crash loop backoff can't happen unless the image is there and it's trying to start the app. And so if it might be trying to start the app and it completely doesn't even start right away, like it just will not start. Like maybe the command is not found or the file isn't even in the image. A lot of these errors will be there in that events list when you use describe. It might describe a little bit more of the error. Yeah. And by the way, with the crash loop backoff, the logs won't always be helpful. So you can do, of course, as always, a kube control logs pod name. And then you can get the logs from the app. But if the app isn't even started because maybe the command in your Docker file is wrong, that's why I always start with my apps. I always build them in Docker first, and I get them working in Docker Compose. And then I'll go to Kubernetes, and I'll try to translate that basic Compose file into Kubernetes YAML so I can get it started in a basic way, without any restrictions, without any of the security stuff, just in a very basic pod spec. And I'll create some deployments, and I'll get it working that way. And then I'll start adding things like not using root, locking it down, stuff like that. Because if I try to go all of that out of the gate, I'm definitely going to have errors. I'm not going to get it right the first time. So I'm going to have failures, and then I'm going to have to debug in Kubernetes. And I find debugging in Kubernetes not as more complicated than if I was just in Docker or Docker Compose. So I will my workflow is usually get the Docker file working well locally on my Docker. Then once the Docker file is working well for all the parts of my app, then I will put those in Compose file and just get that working locally as well. And that helps me define environment variables. It makes sure that I know all the right things for how they talk to each other with the right DNS names. I make sure that I have all the secrets in there that I need. And I can do all that in Compose. The ports, all that stuff. And then I'll translate it over to Kubernetes, maybe using something called Compose with a K, which will convert your Compose YAML to Kubernetes. That'll be my base. And then I will see if that works in Kubernetes without any changes. And then if that works, then that's when I start adding the customization, like the security stuff. So hopefully that helps. Yeah, you all are most welcome for this. I'm glad you all came and took advantage of it. The Kita project. I don't know anything about Kata, so or even if that's how you say it, Kata. So sorry, I'm not going to be able to help you with that, Cloud Surfer, unfortunately. Okay, so Shakti, sorry if I mispronounced that. I have a Docker Compose file, and to integrate it into existing pipelines, I need to convert it into a single Docker file, and I just need to build and add images to repos. Is there a way to do it? So you can't really take a Compose file and turn it into a Docker file because they deal with different things. Docker files are mostly, about build time concerns, like the runs and the envs or the args that you set, the from, those are all build time. The things like the entry point, the CMD or the command, ports, and then some of the envs, a lot of those are runtime. After you've built the image, those are runtime concerns because the entry point and the command never actually run inside of the image, right? They just run when you get to the server and you execute the container. So a Docker Compose file can be about both. So it kind of depends on your Compose file, exactly what your Compose file is. But it mostly deals with runtime concerns. You can technically have a build section in your Compose file, but most people, that's not very complicated. It just usually says build this Docker file. There's not usually a lot there. So it kind of depends on what you're talking about and what you need. Maybe you can give me some more details in the example. But if you have a Compose file, that means you already have a Docker file. So I'm not exactly sure what else you need in your Docker file to run in a pipeline. If you need to just use the Compose file to build in your build pipeline, if you want to use Compose to build your Docker images, do that. Add Compose into your build pipeline servers. Make sure that that plugin is available. And then just use Docker Compose build as your build tool. You can do that, especially if you're using something like Jenkins or something that's a little more low level. A lot of times in hosted CI platforms for building, they already have a Docker build function built in. So you don't even need to use Compose because they provide a lot of stuff for you. That's how I use it with GitHub Actions. I use GitHub Actions primarily, and Docker has released an official GitHub action that does all the build time stuff for me. So I don't need to use Compose because all of those different things about labeling and naming my images and the different architectures I want to build, all that stuff is in the GitHub action. If you're interested in that stuff, by the way, that's all over on my GitHub. You can find all that at github.com/Bret Fisher. And if you just scroll down, you'll see a whole bunch of my repos, and just look for some GitHub Actions stuff there. I talk about GitHub Actions here. I have a whole bunch of GitHub Actions examples, like example workflows in case you want to use those. And those might give you ideas for how to build it in your CI solution, because all the different CI tools, the continuous integration and automation tools, they're not that different, right? They're not so different that you can't take the ideas from one and try to apply it to another. So hopefully that helps. Cloud Surfer's mentioning that sometimes in EKS, the events area is empty for describing a pod. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've not seen that, so I'm not really sure why. I mean, the describe command talks directly to the Kubernetes API, and the Kubernetes API is what also stores the events. So I'm not sure what that is. Something special with EKS, maybe. Maybe EKS is shipping those events elsewhere. I'm not sure. Maybe someone in chat knows. Maybe someone else has experienced EKS issues like that. In a lot of those cases, if you're on EKS, I would recommend some other tool, especially a GUI tool, to help you administrate the cluster. More importantly, something that you can give your devs, if you're the cluster admin, to let them see what's going on with their deployments and with their pods. You don't have to give them read-write access. You can give them just read access. But usually when I'm using Argo CD, which is my deployment tool of choice right now, Argo has a great web GUI that is very useful for basic troubleshooting. And you can give that to the team in a read-only fashion so that they can see what's going on. And they can even, watch their deployments happen while they've shipped their YAML, they've put that in their Git repository, and Argo has picked it up, and then you can watch Argo. The other one I mentioned, Komodoro, is a service. It's a SaaS, and there's a couple of them out there, and I've mentioned them several times. But Komodoro is a service that basically runs a SaaS where you connect it to your cluster, and it is trying to give you insights on things that are not running well, like things that are restarting, or things that can't even be deployed, or errors that you might be getting inside Kubernetes events themselves. I'm not sure it's going to know anything about your app and whether your app has errors. It's not chasing your logs and looking at your log outputs, I don't think. I haven't used it since last year. But we had them on the show, and we talked about it, and I thought it was a very compelling way to just turn on this turnkey solution. I'm trying to see if they have a free version. They might just have like a temporary version. Yeah, I don't see a free option. Yeah, there's trials, but there's no free option. But $10 per node per month. So, you might try Argo first, which is free. You might, I think that, honestly, I think the clouds are going to get better at this. Maybe AWS isn't as good as Azure is on this, but I think that eventually we're going to get more built-in tools from the clouds to deliver this kind of value without us having to go look for third-party tools. But that's just a hope. I don't actually know the plans of the clouds, but that's a hope for me. All right, next one. Can you talk about a day-to-day task of a Kubernetes admin managed or on-prem, Komodoro? It's very much like a sysadmin or a cloud admin. They're very, very similar in their tasking, which is to say they could be one of 50 different things. But until you automate things, everything is manual. So one of your priorities, which is a priority of DevOps, is to automate as much as you can. Eventually, you're going to want to automate your auto scaling. So you're going to want to automate your pod auto scaling based on CPU and memory requirements. If you get a lot of load, add more pods to the replicas. If you need more nodes, add more nodes with a node autoscaler. We had one recently on the show from AWS. If you actually go back 2 months, I had my friend Nirmal on the show from AWS, and we talked about their new project on autoscaling. Just search my YouTube for autoscaling, and you'll find some of that stuff. But that's a primary concern. But once you automate that, you get out of the job of having to add and remove nodes and change that stuff. So one of your big jobs is to maintain and keep things current. So you're going to want to go into GitHub and be aware of all new releases, right? So going to GitHub, like let's just go to the Kubernetes project. So if we go over to Kubernetes, and then underneath the watch section, see what I do? I go under custom, and then I get told about every release. So for any tool that's especially an open source tool that I'm putting into my cluster, Argo, Kubernetes, the Kubernetes dashboard, Ingress, you name it, any of those things, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to mark releases so that I get emails for all new releases, because there might be patch or security releases that I need to know about, right? I'm also going to be doing Kubernetes scans, right? Kubernetes security scans on a regular basis. So we can look at Kubescape, which is my favorite one that I know about. Kubescape here, I'll put this in chat. So Kubescape is a scanner that will help you. Trivy, by the way, now does some of the scanning. Trivy, the CVE scanner, Trivy, is also starting to get into this game of cluster and YAML scanning. But this, when you run it, will give you all sorts of information about what's going on in your cluster. This is mostly around security, some configuration, but mostly related to security stuff. And I want this to be run probably weekly on my clusters, so you want to automate that. And then, of course, you're going to be dealing with anything that requests you get, right? Your dev team says we don't have enough resources, or our pod specs keep failing, or we keep getting crash loop backoffs and we need help with that. So you're going to be taking a lot of requests from the teams that are trying to do stuff on your clusters. And then, like I was saying, you're always going to want to know better monitoring and logging. So you're probably going to be improving your monitoring dashboards. Maybe you're using the cloud-based monitoring, or maybe you're using Datadog, or maybe you're running your own with something like Prometheus, and maybe you're using Loki for logging. Those are probably my two choices for open source tools. By the way, I don't always recommend those because you may not have the time to run and administrate all that infrastructure. So often for small teams, I will say, go use Datadog or Sysdig or one of the other million options for hosted logging and monitoring. And I'll recommend those because it saves you time. And if you don't have the time to really stand up a quality monitoring solution and logging solution, you might want to consider those over rolling your own stuff, right? So those are just some of the things. Obviously, backups are a concern. You're going to be wanting to look at something like Valero, which is a backup solution for Kubernetes for any of those volumes that you want to protect, the data in the volumes. And it doesn't just back up volumes, but it backs up a lot of the resources and other things in Kubernetes as well. So you'll want to look at that. Yeah, that's kind of the typical day-to-day. But again, like most sysadmins and cloud operators, it can be pretty random based on the problems of the day or the requests that are coming in from your customers. All right, what's next? Do I prefer build packs or regular Docker files? That's a great question. I prefer Docker files because I know what I'm doing with Docker files. So Docker build packs to me take away some of the burden of having to know how to create my own Docker file. But I feel like a team, as they mature, I feel like they need something a little bit more custom than what a build pack provides. I don't like a bunch of unnecessary things in my images. And I like, because I've done Docker images for 8 years now, I feel like I understand BuildKit, the Docker builder that is advanced and has a lot of functionality for multi-stage. And I really know how to keep my production images clean while providing a different stage for dev and test that has more things in it. So that's how I teach it, is to stick with the Docker files, create custom dev test setups, and then prod setups that don't have those dev dependencies, right? That don't include the testing frameworks, because that's what you want. You want lean production systems. So that's how I teach it. I'll be honest, I haven't gone to production with build packs for long periods of time, so I don't really have, day two operator build pack experience. But most of the people I talk to about that have used both really talk about build packs is great if you don't know anything about Docker files and you don't care to know anything about Docker files, and you really just want the easy button. But I feel like for most teams, eventually Docker files are the way to go. All right, what's next? By the way, hi, Martin. I see you. What's your roadmap for learning Docker and Kubernetes? Really interested on DevOps and starting to learn recently. So my courses are below. Thanks for joining. You can learn Docker Mastery first. That teaches you all the basics of Docker, Docker Compose, and then starts teaching you about Kubernetes, and talks a little bit about security concerns, production concerns. It teaches you some Swarm in case you want to use really small environments and you don't need the complexity of Kubernetes. You can still use Swarm, which is still being maintained by Mirantis, as well as Docker, who's taking any of the code Mirantis has and throwing it into the Docker engine. And then it talks about registry and some other tools. So it teaches you a lot. And then if you want to go deeper into Kubernetes, you can go into Kubernetes Mastery, another course of mine. If you like Swarm, there's another Swarm Mastery course you can take after that has more stuff in it. And then there's a Docker for Node.js course. So if you happen to be a JavaScript person looking at Node.js, I teach the sort of deeper stuff around how to develop and deploy your code from Node.js using Docker. So all the coupons are below. You can get those really cheap with the coupons, and hopefully you have a good experience, and I'll see you in the courses. Thanks for asking. compose file for Kafka with Zookeeper and Connect. I know nothing about Kafka and Zookeeper, so I try to avoid Zookeeper at all costs because it's complicated and I'm not generally a fan of complexity. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to be the person to ask about Kafka. Ooh, look at that. Martin throwing some knowledge down. Rad Panda. I guess that's how you say it, Rad Panda. That's pretty good. It's a modern Kafka alternative. If my current go-to CI is GitHub Actions. Well, to be more accurate, it's wherever your code lives. So CI and CD to me are just automation. And all of the platforms, there is a bunch of stuff happening in the automation scene, right? You start to see buzzwords like AI-based automation and stuff like that. But that's just the evolution and maturity of the CI and CD landscape. So you've got legacy projects like Jenkins, and these were concepts that came up 15 years ago, 20 years ago maybe, that I think we've moved on from those. And so those older solutions are much more involved. You have to spend more time with them. They're much more complex. And really nowadays, we're all hosting our cloud we're hosting our code in the cloud, most of us. And when we do that, that platform usually has an automation platform built in. And so that, I think, is the future. I think what we're going to experience is a consolidation of these platforms where every place to host your code has automation behind it. And these companies have a lot of money, so their platforms are going to get much better over time. And then we have all the smaller players that are, I would call, boutique CI solutions that are or bespoke, and I think that either they're going to have to find a very specific niche that maybe like I used to know of one that was all about Node.js. They actually hosted the servers. They had their own CI automation, but it was purely for Node.js. So you had to be using JavaScript and TypeScript on their platform. But it was easier for you to do it there. The problem was the minute you wanted to use something else, it wasn't easy to use that there. So I think those players are going to have to figure out their own advantage. It's hard to compete with the likes of Microsoft and Bitbucket and GitLab and some of these bigger alternatives. So I'm not looking for small little new players that have an interesting niche, because I feel like those are only going to be interesting for so long until they're either bought up or outcompeted by having too much money with the competition. So I right now am very bullish on GitHub Actions, because I think that platform is very powerful. And with the now, whatever it is, 13,000 free plugins or actions that you can use, all of the companies are there. All the players and all the tools have GitHub Actions now. If I go to something else like Drone's Docker extension is years out of date, and there's no official Docker engine things on it at all. Docker doesn't work for that platform. They don't make stuff for that platform. They just focus on GitHub Actions and other major players. So I'm very bullish on the big guys, like GitHub. That's a good question, though. Yeah, how about using the Devtron SaaS tool, which has integrated Argo CD? So again, I look at these as bespoke or boutique players in the industry, and they all have a neat, interesting niche. Argo themselves are releasing, the company behind that, Acuity, is releasing their own hosted Argo CD solution for all the Argo products, and they're going to add more on it. So if I was going to look for hosted Argo, I would probably go with the company that makes it. I know that there are tons of other automation and DevOps tools out there. I'm not knocking them and saying that they're not worth trying, but I just can't keep up with all of them. And none of the companies I work with or clients that I've ever use any of the niche players. They're always interested in, a company that's going to be here in 5 years and that's going to still be very competitive in 5 years. So they tend to invest in, CloudBees, the company behind Jenkins. They have other variants, Jenkins X and other things. And then the clouds themselves, because those clouds are very interested in you automating on their cloud. So they're all building out automation engines. And so that's where I tend to focus. I just don't have enough time. But please, if you've tried some and you like them, put it in chat so other people will know which ones you like or don't like. Because, we're all trying to figure out what's the right tool for the job. And I don't know. I don't have all the answers for that. I just know what I like. And mostly I like them because I know them, right? They work for me because I know them. I know I don't like Jenkins because it's 10 times the amount of work as GitHub Actions. So there you go. All right, let's see this next question here. All right, so right now, I'm just going to call you Oliver. Oliver, great content you're providing. Thank you. I've got some microservices running in production using only Docker Compose. Do I need to move to Docker Swarm before Kubernetes? No. So if you're using Docker Compose right now, that tells me that you're using one server, because Docker Compose doesn't know about multiple servers. So that sounds like you're pretty small, right? Like you have a very small amount of infrastructure. So Swarm might be the right thing for you if you're looking for redundancy and availability, right? Because Compose isn't going to reschedule your apps. It'll restart it if it crashes, but it doesn't do rolling updates. It doesn't really do anything about health checks. If your app is still running, but its health check is failing, Compose won't do anything about it. So you have to go to Swarm or Kubernetes in order to get those benefits. In your case, if it's just one server or if you're a really small environment, Kubernetes may be overkill. Certainly running your own Kubernetes is overkill. You should definitely, if you're going to consider it, use a cloud. Use a cloud that has it built in. But if you're just a few containers and you're using a cloud, I would look at the alternatives. For example, on Google, they have Google Cloud Run. Google Cloud Run doesn't require Kubernetes, but it does allow you to run containers without having to manage the server, patch the server every month, make sure Docker's updated, and make sure that it does all the things that you need it to do, but it removes the burden of being a sysadmin. And that's the future of all this container stuff, is getting us out of the way of having to be sysadmins. I mean, some environments, if you work at Netflix, there's probably a lot of sysadmins there. But for most of us, we don't really need to be logging into SSH on servers and configuring apt and yum packages, and we don't have to do that anymore. Even with Kubernetes on AWS, you have Kubernetes, you have EKS with not autopilot, with I said autopilot, that's Google. The other thing, someone tell me in chat, the thing on Amazon that allows you to run your EKS and your ECS. My brain is not working right now. Anyway, you have all these great tools that remove the burden. And so if you're running Docker Compose, that means that you're burdened with running the server. So maybe if you have more specific questions on that, like if you're running it in a data center, you can do all that stuff. Yeah, I'm always looking for the simplest solution for running my containers, and it's extremely rare. It's very rare now that I will ever choose to spin up my own server. Because even on small companies like DigitalOcean Cloud, which is a pretty small company compared to AWS, even DigitalOcean has their own in-house Kubernetes that I just have to write one command and it spins up a whole cluster for me. So Fargo, there we go. Thanks, Martin. So yeah, Fargo, yeah. Fargate, not Fargo. Fargate. So Fargate is that AWS version where you don't even have to manage the nodes. And Google and Azure, I believe, had the same examples. Autopilot on Google. I don't remember what Azure's is called. But it gets you completely out of the job of managing servers. You never have to worry about patching your servers. You do have to patch your app dependencies, but you can ignore the servers because they're managed for you. Is there a best practice for Kubernetes admins that can follow setting up service accounts for RBAC authorization? I don't know. I don't have any myself, and I don't know. I can't think of any resources right away. other than just Googling it. So sorry, I'm not going to have answers to that. I'm usually just using the RBAC model that's built out of the box with whatever environment, like, Rancher or VMware Tanzu or all these other ones. They tend to come with their own preferences about how you do that stuff, and they help keep you from accidentally implementing bad policies a little bit. So I don't really get into the world of RBAC design for service accounts. I just do usually I'm doing that service account stuff for a tool that I've downloaded to install, and it needs service accounts. So I'm just doing whatever they told me to do. I'm not really, designing 1,000-node RBAC clusters for enterprise companies. So that's unfortunately not my area of expertise. Oh yeah, the build pack thing fell on your feet today. Yeah. I mean, I don't really think there's any, if you've already built Docker files, there's no reason to go back to build packs. I don't see that, this, in my opinion, and I'm not a build pack expert, so there may be new advanced features that I don't know about, but I don't, at the end of the day, it's really just about building your image. It doesn't impact running your image. They both will output a image that you run in as a container. So I think build packs are just meant to make it easier if you're having a really hard time with your Docker files. So ELK versus EFK. I don't really have a strong opinion there. I actually think that the way a lot of people are going right now is Loki. So neither. Look at Loki. Because the Grafana company is kind of taking that project on, and it does provide a little bit of synergy between your logging and monitoring, where I still feel like the ELK, EFK stuff is very much logging oriented. I do tend to like the platforms that consolidate all that stuff. So, talk about Terraform. What would you like me to talk about? I need specific questions. You can't just throw topics at me of a tool name and then I know what you need to know. So, any courses on learning Helm? I plan to add Helm to the Kubernetes Mastery course. I don't have a date for that yet, but that is in scope of that course, and I'm behind schedule on adding new sections. I know. And I actually just replied to someone in Twitter yesterday who was asking about that. Not Helm specifically, but new stuff for Kubernetes Mastery. That will be coming as soon as the Docker Mastery stuff gets updated. By the way, you can follow along with all that. In case you're in the courses, you can now follow along on bret.show/course updates. It takes you to a public GitHub project. I'll throw this in chat. So this, well, it's kind of big on the screen. Let me zoom out. So this is the public project of all things that are broken or degraded, meaning that there's a newer version or something's been deprecated. So I need to update something. It's not truly broken, but it needs to be updated to reflect modern things. And then enhancements or new ideas for new content or content that I've already promised to deliver that hasn't been delivered. So that's all here, and I work on it weekly. And I just shipped some new videos in Docker Mastery at the very beginning of the course a couple of weeks ago. The ones I'm working on right now are updating all of the installation videos, which are going to be quite different than what they were existing, because those are 5 years old, and a lot of stuff's changed with the way you install Docker. It's way easier now. So those videos are actually going to get shorter, because nowadays it's just, the answer is install Docker Desktop. In all cases, just install Docker Desktop. As long as you're using a modern supported operating system now, it supports Linux, Mac, and Windows. So you can use it for learning in my courses for free, no matter where you work, because the license strictly allows for learning. So even if you work in an enterprise, you're allowed to install Docker Desktop for learning if you can't pay for it. So next after that is going to be updating some of the Kubernetes stuff to reflect the changes in the run command. And then you'll start to see new content roll into both courses. So Kubernetes alternatives for FreeBSD. Not really. As far as I know, Docker doesn't officially build any BSD-based Docker engines, and I don't know if Cryo or Containerd have a container runtime for FreeBSD. The last I checked, one of the problems with the BSD OS is they didn't necessarily have all of the kernel features necessary for modern day container running. I know that some people have gotten Docker in the past to work on FreeBSD. I'm a huge fan of FreeBSD. Haven't ran it in a while, but I was using FreeBSD in the 90s, That's right. And I even bought the shirt from their merch store because I love the little demon so much with the pitchfork. He's really cute. But I bought that way back in the day, and before we had, things like Gentoo and Ubuntu and stuff like that. So I was a big FreeBSD fan. So I am sad that we don't have a great alternative there. But someone tell me in chat, have you heard of a Kubernetes, or does Containerd or Cryo run on any of the BSDs? OpenBSD, NetBSD, FreeBSD? I don't actually know. I just haven't been in the BSDs lately. The whole world talks about Linux all the time, so I get distracted and I don't get to play with things like Solaris. Well, welcome, Black Summer. Glad you're here. Hey, Daniel, autoscaling. Is that a specific question? I'm not sure if are you asking? What are you asking about autoscaling? I'm happy to answer the question if you give me some more details. Yeah, Peloton, Fargate. That's what I was thinking of. Current thoughts on traffic, especially in a high security environment. I think traffic is great. It's extremely simple. It's a single binary. It is unfortunate that some of the features I wish were in the free version are only in the paid version. But if you're working in a highly secured environment, or even just in an enterprise environment, you probably should consider paying for some of these tools. You're probably paying for Linux or Kubernetes support. So I would argue that you probably need to pay for your ingress and load balancing support. And I think traffic is very simple to manage and use. It has a lot of neat new features, including the middleware features that most people don't even know about yet. And they have now a cloud option for managing from the cloud. So I am a fan. My two favorite ingresses, ironically, Nginx is no longer one of them. It is the default. There's nothing really wrong with it. But I like Contour with the Envoy project. And I like Traffic. I am technically a traffic ambassador, but that's just because I'm a fan of the tool. It still supports Docker and Swarm out of the box, and Kubernetes. Out of the box, the free version doesn't provide true high availability. And let me explain what that really means. Is when you want to do something like you want to use Let's Encrypt and you want traffic to go and get the certificates for you, it will need a place to store those. And historically, it has stored those itself. And so then the problem becomes is how do you get multiple pods? Like, let's say you're running one traffic on each node. How do you get all those to know about the certificates that one of them went and got, right? Because one of them will go and do the work of Let's Encrypt, and it'll come back. So you need some sort of central repository. To my knowledge, Traffic doesn't use Cert Manager for free. So you have to pay for it to get the advanced functionality of centralized control. Otherwise, what you can do in smaller clusters, it's totally fine, I think, to do this, is you just run one proxy. If it's a 10 node cluster, you run one proxy. Maybe you run one proxy for certain parts of your apps, and you can run multiple proxies on different nodes, or even on the same node if it's on different ports. And then if the pod fails, the traffic pod fails, it's just going to recreate it, right? So I don't think I've ever actually had a traffic pod crash. But when you start to scale up and you need more resources, you need more capacity, and you need to guarantee uptime across nodes with true high availability, that's when you probably should pay for traffic and then get the high availability features. So hopefully that helps. Here's an interesting question. Open source projects on Docker to contribute for freshers. I like that word, freshers. Is that better than noob? I guess noob is maybe, it's a derogatory term. Maybe freshers is more of a positive term. I like that. I've heard it a couple times before, but maybe the first time on this show. So thank you. You get some claps. So Mohammed, open source project for Docker to contribute for freshers. I would say probably if you're talking about strictly code, look right now at Docker extensions. I would say that Docker extensions it's a brand new thing. It's only been out 3 or 4 months. It's only for Docker Desktop. But if you're using Docker Desktop, Docker extensions can be a really interesting way to add functionality, not just to Docker itself, but also to the GUI of Docker Desktop. So check out Docker extensions. They have a whole SDK on it. And there's multiple people contributing almost weekly new projects to the extensions list. And if you have Docker Desktop and you didn't know about extensions, make sure you got updated Docker Desktop. I think it's 4.10 is the latest. And then when you go into the GUI, there's a new extensions option, and each release they're adding more and more plugins. Now you can always go and install a plugin outside of the GUI, but they're adding more to the store. I don't think they really have they don't call it the store. It's just called the extensions list or whatever. But there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there, including VPNs, including adding Portainer or other tooling, logging tools, disk monitoring tools or analysis tools, all sorts of really cool stuff in there, including doing stuff like setting up an OpenShift cluster inside of Docker Desktop, which I would have never even thought you'd want to do. But it's actually an interesting idea so that I don't have to be an expert. If I just want to play around with OpenShift, I can do it with a click. It's pretty neat. So go check that out. That would be one of my recommendations. All right. Paolo, I'm going to give you the answer to this great question. What is the best order for stages in a Docker file? Now, this is an opinion, right? A lot of people will have a different opinion, but the way that I use and teach it is I focus on production first. And there's a reason for that. I'm not a fan of adding all of the stuff you need for dev and test and then later deleting or removing those things. Right? Because I feel like that's less clean and less of a guarantee that I only have what I expect, right? I also, depending on how you do your stages, you're not really deleting those things from the image. You might end up with bloated layers where the layers with all the big stuff in them are still there. So if you go and look at my GitHub repos, and let me see if I can find you a repo. I have examples of this, detailed examples. And one of them, let me make sure I have the right one here. So an example I'll give you, I'm just going to show you on screen. How about a demo? Would you like a demo? So this is from my DockerCon talk, the same one I just linked to earlier. So available in my GitHub. It's called Node.js Rocks in Docker. And so in this one, what I walk you through is adding the stage by stage. So you start with this, what I call the base stage, which doesn't include code. It just includes the dependencies for the OS that you need in order to start installing your app dependencies. So in other words, it's the same thing, and then it includes here, and this I chose for it to be the same stage, to only install the production dependencies. So that stage is going to be used in all future stages. And then when I'm wanting to do something like testing or development, I will target those stages, which will add new stuff to the production stage for all those extra tools and things that I need to do testing and dev. And then I might even have an audit stage where if I choose to, and this is not always my recommendation, but if I choose to do things like npm audit, which looks for npm vulnerabilities, or using a trivy command, I don't normally recommend scanning from within inside an image. Usually I do that from my automation platform, but maybe you don't have that and maybe you want to just stick it in a stage. You could do that as well. And then you'll notice at the very, very end, once all that's done, my from goes back to my source, which is way up here. And my source only comes from base. So in essence, when I ship to production, I'm not rebuilding. That's the key here. It's not rebuilding the image because we don't really want to rebuild an image after we've tested it. What it's doing is, because of the caching mechanism in Docker and BuildKit, it's just removing the layers and then giving a new SHA hash. So in theory, it's the exact same bits of your code and your production dependencies that you built with. It's just removing the extra layers that we added later on for dev and test. Now, some might argue that, well, then that's not truly testing, but that's fine. If you want to test externally, maybe you have Selenium. I had to think about it for a second. Selenium or some other external tester. Maybe it's an API or website, and you need to test from another container. Well, then you could use that prod image and truly test against it, right? But usually when we test, like when we do unit testing, if we do unit testing in a container build, then, or even, we build a container and then we have to unit test it later, we're doing that inside the container image that we just built, and it has to have all the testing frameworks. Maybe we have fixtures or other testing things in there that need to be done in the container, and we don't really want that stuff in production, ideally. So the way I approach that is by adding those layers on. Not everyone does this the same way. Some people would rather put all that stuff in anyway and then test that image and just ship it to production, even though it's big and bloated, in my opinion. But that's okay. That's just their way. They maybe they want an easier path and less complexity, because as you can see, my Docker file there was 60 lines. So maybe you don't like such a complex Docker file, but that's how I do it. Hopefully that helps. That was a great question. What are the job opportunities for someone who knows only Docker and Kubernetes? Well, you're probably going to be going for either a build engineer job, a DevOps oriented job, or a cluster administration job. Some companies are big enough that really all they're looking for is container people, container experts that know Docker and Kubernetes. And you might do a lot of different things, but they really just need people, especially in companies that are not what I would call tip of the spear. Maybe these are laggard companies that are just now getting into containers, and they need someone to help them on their container journey. And their staff don't know containers yet because they maybe have all worked there for 5 years. And since they don't have any containers yet, all those people that have worked there for 5 years have not used containers. So those jobs do exist. Even if you're new, they maybe just want to hire you as a junior person, but they need someone with at least some of that knowledge. So those jobs exist. The reality is there are all kinds of jobs. There are jobs where your only job is to help with Docker files and to use the build engine or design a build engine or automation platform that's going to build those Docker images and then store them in a registry. And then maybe part of your job is to manage the image registries. So, and in a big company, that's a full-time job. In a small team, that's just a part-time role for somebody that's doing something else. So it really depends on what you're going for and where you're going to be looking, right? Hopefully that helps. But I think, there's jobs out there, right? Like just right now, AWS has, last time I saw, 30,000 jobs available to work at Amazon. So there's lots of jobs. It's just a question of finding the one that meets your experience level. And so you're not trying to go for something that you're not qualified for. And just be honest. Like sometimes companies are happy with inexperience. They care more about what we talked about yesterday in our high fivers group. Back to the Patreon for a second. The Patreon membership, if you didn't know, you can get a Patreon membership with me. And if you get in the high fivers group, you get access to a monthly meetup. And we talk about stuff like this. And one of the topics yesterday was hiring based on empathy and on abilities to learn and share, not hiring based on what you know today. And that has shifted for the last 30 years. That has been changing. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, we were hiring based on what you knew and your experience. Those were the two primary things. What do you know and what have you done? But nowadays, that still matters, but it matters even less because now what we know today will not be relevant in a year or two. So it's now more important than ever to know, how do you learn? How current are you? Are you keeping up to date on your learning? And then how do you share with others? How are you empathetic to others in your team? And can you help them with their problems? Can you imagine their problems when you're doing your work and work with them to collaborate? Because none of us work alone. We all work with a team, and that team usually needs your advice and needs your expertise. So empathy and the ability to share your information is very, very important. If I'm running a team, I'm hiring based on an order of priority, your personality and empathy, and how well you work with others. I will probably put you in a room with people and help you and have you all work on something together just to see how you work. And then how do you learn? How current is your learning? How do you share your learning? Are you putting stuff on the internet? Are you sharing your knowledge? Because if you don't share on the internet, you're probably not going to share with your coworkers. It's just kind of I'm going to go look at your GitHub because I believe in the GitHub registry. I'm sorry, the GitHub resume. I believe in the GitHub resume. And I think everyone, including DevOps professionals, should have stuff they've done on GitHub, open source stuff, because this is all open source. And if you're not in that community, you're not going to have as good of an effect on my team as someone who's involved in the community, is learning open source, and has been keeping up to date. And then finally, I will then eventually get to your experience and your past learnings and what you already know. What certifications you might have taken. At this point, I don't really care whether you went to university. This is just me as a hiring manager. That's my preferences, because I've hired people based on experience and knowledge, and they haven't always turned out great. But when I focus on personality, their empathy towards others, their ability to teach and share their knowledge with others, and I get people, whenever I do that, I get people that they may not know the thing I need them to know today, but they'll learn it really quickly and they'll know it next week, and then they can solve the problems we have, and then they'll share it with others, which is what I'd really need in my teams, right? So hopefully that helps. Coming out soon. Yeah. Peloton's been around for a while, so he knows. He knows that I'm always slower at getting things out than I intend to. You all are most welcome for the answers. All right, we're getting caught up here on questions. Yeah, MobyMoby is where the Docker source code lives on GitHub. In case you didn't know, it's still called MobyMoby. There's been discussion for years about renaming it back to Docker, but for now it's still called MobyMoby. If you're new to Go and you're new to open source programming, it will be very intimidating there, I think, because if you're there's features there that people have been asking for years, and because the code base is so complex and extensive, but you can read the code, right? If you're interested and curious about something in Docker, you can go find the source code there. Like, for example, where do those names come from that name my container automatically? When you don't specify a name, you get a random name, and where does that come from? It's all in source code. So you can go look at that and kind of start to learn what Docker's doing under the hood. Hey, thanks so much for the super chat. Sudarshan, sorry if I mispronounced that. Thank you so much for the super chat. I really appreciate you all supporting this show. And that's what makes this community so awesome, is that we all want to help each other. I appreciate it. What's next? Why in JKE is the config map kubedns empty? That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. Maybe someone in chat does. Hopefully they do. Is Kubernetes a good choice for stateful applications? Absolutely. Kubernetes is a great choice for applications. It has never been a better time to run containers that are stateful than it is today, because we have more features than ever that focus on stateful. We didn't always have those features 5-7 years ago. So, I know companies that have been running databases and containers for five plus years. So that's something you should consider. Now, if it's something that if it's the only reason to run Kubernetes, maybe you want to look at something else. But again, I always look for the easiest way to run my containers. And on the cloud, if it's a database or Redis or something like that, I really want to use the cloud's services. I don't want to run those myself. I really don't, because they're going to be way better at it. You might think it's cheaper to run it yourself, but when was the last time you had all your free time available to manage your databases? Are you monitoring them? Are they redundant? Are you testing the failover? Are you testing restores? Are you fully monitoring it to the point that you would get up at 3 in the morning if the database went down? These are all things the cloud does for you. So pay them the few extra dollars, run that stuff there. I try to avoid all persistent storage solutions as I can, because that's just adding complexity. So on some monolith apps, I will work with teams to take that monolith, which is used to talking to files on the hard drive and then changing files on the hard drive, which makes it persistent. It requires persistent storage. And I will work with them to change that model so that it's not writing the files anymore. It's using object storage, or it's using database storage, or key value storage, or something that's not in Kubernetes, so that they can use a cloud-hosted solution. That's way more scalable, way easier than it is to have a whole bunch of containers with volumes attached and have to worry about backing up those volumes. And then worrying about things like, what if those files are open when I back them up? Is open file backup supported with your particular application? Do you even know what that means? Those are all complicated things that have to do with storage. For example, when you back up a MySQL database, you can't just back up the file. You have to do a proper backup using a proper SQL backup, which will then, it syncs the database to disk. It makes sure that everything is exported when it's exporting, and then you can back up the export file. Right? So these are all concerns that happen with any app or any solution that's using and writing files. And if it's doing that, you have to test those things. And it's a lot of complexity. And I just try to avoid it. So in cloud native, we tend to try to avoid all disk writes from our own containers. We ideally want all of our apps to be stateless and to be able to run everywhere. And then we use back-end cloud services for all of our state and all of our files and all that stuff. That's a modern cloud native approach. What do I think about the script of GCP cloud versus AWS in the industries in the future? Not sure what the question is about. Hey, thank you. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. You get another mega horn or a reggae horn or whatever they call it. Thanks so much for another super chat. Back to the question, GCP versus AWS for the industries in the future. I mean, they're both viable. So the number one cloud is AWS. The number two cloud in terms of size and market cap is Azure, Microsoft Azure. And then Google is a distant third. And then everyone else is trying to play catch up. So Google is, in terms of the big three, Google is the smallest. But, and ironically, if you follow Google's, I don't talk about this much, but if you follow Google's quarterly earnings calls, there has been mention over the last year, I believe, that if the Google Cloud can't make more profit, that they may not keep it, which sounds very, very like that makes me nervous. I have a hard time believing that GCP would ever go away, but when you start talking about Alphabet, their parent company, and the profit margins of their cloud, they had, this is my understanding, they had goals for what that GCP needed to, Google Cloud, Google Compute needed to do. And my understanding is they're not necessarily hitting those targets. So yeah, I would say that if there was ever a risk, it's probably on the Google end of things, but it's hard to imagine at this point with so many people on there that they would just kill it. I don't know. But Google, of all of the clouds, Google is the company that loves to kill products, right? They make experiments and they kill them. It happens all the time. So if I had to pick, I'm not particularly nervous about Google. I would be fine using Google in my company. But here's the thing. If you're using containers and you're using Kubernetes for most of your stuff, except for that persistent storage stuff, shifting to another cloud isn't a nightmare scenario, right? It shouldn't be that huge of an effort. I mean, yeah, it might take weeks or months, but you could do it. And so if you had to get off for some reason, then you could do it. That's the promise of containers and Kubernetes, is that what was happening was that the clouds were creating all their own ideas for everything, and there was no commonality. And so these layers of abstraction, first the container, then the orchestrator, these levels of abstraction are allowing an industry standard to form that we can now trust that I can do the same thing, or 90% of the same thing on Azure as I can on Google or whatever. So just keep going down the container road. Worry less about whether the cloud is the right cloud because they all have a lot of the same stuff. And then as you mature, you might decide that something you use on Azure is better because you care more about it, and you might move from Google or something else to that. I don't know. It just depends. But I don't really I have not yet worked with anyone that has moved from one cloud to another, unless they're bought by that cloud, which I did see once. When you're in Azure and your company is bought by Google, you tend to want to move to Google Cloud because you're forced to. So, sorry, on the Terraform question, I'm not sure what you need me to tell you about Terraform. So maybe some specific questions about Terraform. Terraform is a configuration language for cloud and infrastructure in your data center. So it's an infrastructure management tool. I'm not sure what else you'd like to know. So if you have any details, let me know. Why so many features keep coming to Kubernetes? Learning Kubernetes means too tedious to learn all the optics and areas. Naga, I would actually disagree a little bit. So yes, it is, like every one of these technologies, a lot to learn at first. But you don't have to learn all of Kubernetes to use Kubernetes. For example, there is close to 100, there's over 50 resource types in a default Kubernetes cluster. And I teach a dozen of them, right? Because there's really only like a major dozen that most people need, right? You got your deployments, your pods, your secrets, your config maps, maybe a daemon set or a stateful set on occasion, services, ingress, maybe a few service accounts, right? Maybe a pod security, maybe namespace, obviously namespaces because that's a universal thing. But if I just named those, and that's maybe 10 at the most. So you don't need to learn all of Kubernetes. You can run Kubernetes all day on a cloud-hosted Kubernetes and not know what the scheduler is, and not know the difference between the scheduler and the controller manager, or what ports and how etcd runs. You can ignore all that and just be a user of Kubernetes and just learn if you want to be a Kubernetes administrator, yes, you would learn all those things. But most of us will never administrate Kubernetes clusters, especially in the future. As the cloud gets better at hosting Kubernetes, we will spend less time administrating Kubernetes itself. So I would say learn what you need to know now. Most people I work with, by the way, don't know. They use Kubernetes all day and they don't know a third of the resource types in Kubernetes, but they use it all day to deploy their apps. So they just learn enough to get started. Like I said, deployments, secrets, config maps, namespaces, services, ingress. That's kind of the core, and of course the pod spec is a part of that, but that's the core stuff that everybody needs to know. And then once you've learned that, you can probably start deploying apps and not need to know a lot of the other stuff for a long time. So maybe try that, and maybe it won't feel so overwhelming. Just because, for example, they're coming out with a new gateway API that will technically be a superset of the functionality as ingress, doesn't mean you need to know the gateway API. People have been running Kubernetes for 7 years without it. So just because it's a new feature, do we really need to know about it? Not necessarily. You could ignore it. And that is true with Docker. That's true with Compose. That's true with our operating systems that we're running right now. Do you know everything about your operating system? Probably not. I don't know everything about a Mac, but I've been using it all day for a decade. So I think that in the industry, we give this essence of like, you must be the expert, but that's not true. That's not true. Most people that use Docker are not thorough experts on exactly what C groups and namespaces are, which is the foundations for how Docker works. And they don't know all the Linux system calls, or even 2 of them, which is how Docker works. So I would say that Kubernetes, it has 2 sides to it. It presents like an admin side for those that really want to go get certified to administrate a cluster and build their own clusters. And then there's the rest of us who, that's why the CKAD exists, is that certification is really just for application developers that need to use Kubernetes, not for people that need to know how to administrate it. Hopefully that helps, though, because I do understand your concern around there's a lot to learn. So I tend to learn just enough. I call it just-in-time learning. We talked about it yesterday on the High Fiver group. available in Discord. You can get in the high fivers, and we talked about it yesterday about the old model used to be learning everything up front, and then you have your knowledge, now go do work. Nowadays, what we all have to deal with is just-in-time learning. I have a problem, I need to solve it, let me go learn how to solve it. And that's how I learn, that's how I teach. I don't teach people concepts they don't need right now. So I only teach them what I know they're going to need, and then as they have more problems, I will help them, with consulting or whatever. I will help them learn those parts. And that's how I learn myself, is I just learn what I need. I won't learn the new gateway API that just hit beta until I really, really need it. It's pretty neat. I'm excited about it, but I'm not going to learn it until I really need it because I'll just forget, right? Well, we all forget what we're learning if we don't use it. So that's what I do. Oh, the scope of a GCP versus AWS. Well, AWS is going to have a lot more features and functionality, but Google has their own way of doing things. So I find that certain developers really prefer Google over AWS just because they prefer the experience that they have on Google. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I believe that Google is faster at deploying a Kubernetes cluster than AWS is. But AWS has 1,000 services, right? Like there's this joke of the alphabet soup of all the things that AWS has. So AWS is going to have very niche services that you don't see necessarily yet in Google. So it kind of just depends. It's hard to evaluate unless you have a full specification of all your requirements. And let's go look at the cloud together to see if Google can work for you. Great. Companies may want to run certain workloads, and they might have opinions that are beyond just the technical features of a cloud. They might say, we're not going to run on Azure, and this is a common thing. Not Azure. There's some companies that will not run on AWS because they make a product. Maybe it's a real world physical product, and they're actually scared that Amazon, for whatever reason, might be looking at their stuff because they're on their cloud and then compete with them. I don't know that that's a rational concern, but I know companies that have done this where they just won't stay on Amazon. They will go to a different cloud because they're afraid they don't want to have to worry about competition from AWS. So anyway, there's all sorts of reasons. It might be cost. You might do a cost estimate and figure out that one is cheaper for your needs than another. So yeah, totally depends. Anton, I'm reading your question. So a couple of things. One, is there easier ways to see what's going on beyond just TCP dumping in the container? So not necessarily. So if you're familiar with TCP dump, there's other Linux tools that do similar things, right? There's Netcat, there's other things. So depending on what you're trying to do, you might just look at other Linux tools. But if you're looking at is there a more comprehensive tool that maybe does all this? The first thing I would say is if you need more insight into what's actually happening and it's web services, like you're largely focused on web services, you might want to look at a service mesh. A service mesh does many things, but one of the things a service mesh can help with is observability. And because it sits in the middle of all of your HTTP traffic, it is able to do things like monitor, bandwidth and other traffic patterns. So you might look at a service mesh. There's lots of them out there. An easy one to maybe get started with might be Glue, and I know it's not the most popular. From Solo.io, but if I go over, just go and look at the Solo.io site. They were one of the first. I mentioned them because they were one of the first companies I actually used for service mesh and service mesh-like things. And so they have a product set. It's fairly easy to use. I find it easy to get started. That's not true of all service meshes. Traffic also has their own service mesh that's very simple to use. And I think it's just called Traffic Mesh. And so you can check that one out as well. What those things do, one of the things that they do is that they add proxy layers in all the different nodes so that all your services internally, when they're talking to each other, again, over HTTP, they can they go through these proxies, which then increases observability through those proxies tracking. So anyway, that's just a way to get started. I would try to check those out. I don't, and maybe someone in chat can tell you, but I don't know of a dedicated tool for Kubernetes or clusters. And I may know of the tool and have already forgotten, but I don't know of a tool that does exactly what you're asking for that's different than TCP dump. It might exist. It probably exists, and I just don't know it. But yeah, if you have to debug low-level stuff sometimes, obviously TCP dump or any of the other Linux sysadmin utilities from the command line, they can be very powerful and easy to use, but they can also be hard to decipher what's really going on. So maybe something like a service mesh will help you. How to handle difficult situation or task in Kubernetes. Can you please tell one of the examples? So Mohan, I'm not sure really what you're asking for. Handle a difficult situation or task. Well, I think troubleshooting in general is just difficult. Earlier in this show, if you weren't here, in the show, I went through a whole bunch of different troubleshooting tools and products. So just back up, to the beginning and watch from the beginning, because I already went through a bunch of that stuff. So sorry if you missed that. But troubleshooting is probably the hardest thing. One of the hardest things used to be setup, but we have way better, easier ways to set up Kubernetes nowadays. So that's not really a concern anymore. How does blue-green deployment work in Kubernetes? I mean, how does the cutover happen? Well, when you start doing blue-green, you need to really be focused on how exactly your clients in your app behave with regard to connections. And that forces you to have to really learn your app, and you have to learn your framework, and then you have to learn what TCP or UDP ports you're using and how do those behave. If you're using HTTP, is it using long polling? Is it using WebSockets? All those things matter. And so you have to really drill down into your app. And this is true of any, whether it's rolling updates or blue-green or canary, is that you have to know your app. You're the one building it or deploying it. So you have to understand how your app works. What happens if a user's uploading a file and I decide to do a rolling update or a blue-green deployment in the middle of them uploading a file? Does it wait? Does my app actually wait for the file to be finished uploading? Or does it just cut them off when the container receives a sigint command? And if you don't know what sigint is, you've got to do that work. You've got to do the research of learning how do apps shut down. And I teach this a lot. I mentioned it in my Docker Mastery course. I have a video, at least one video on that. I talk more about it in my Docker for Node.js stuff. So look into that. Just search Bret Fisher, Docker for Node.js. You'll find me talking at length about shutdown of apps. Shutdown is just as important as startup of apps, but most people don't focus on shutdown. They don't actually know what exactly happens at the packet level. For example, how does your TCP connection get terminated? Is it terminated gracefully in your app? Because most programming languages by default won't. The minute you tell Python to just stop, it'll just stop. It doesn't care what the users were doing. It'll kill it. So you have to learn that first, because it's not really about Kubernetes. Kubernetes will wait as long as your app waits, as long as you set it. Like by default, Kubernetes waits 30 seconds and then it'll kill your app. But you would override that inside your pod spec and you would tell it, this is how many seconds you have to wait for my app to close. Maybe it's 5 minutes. Maybe it's 5 hours. It really just depends on your app. But then inside your app code, you probably are going to have to start tracking connections, or maybe make it the load balancer's job, but tracking connections so that you know when people are done using that container so that you can shut it down. The core goal there is that when Kubernetes is told to shut down your pod, regardless of your deployment method or your update method, doesn't matter. Blue, green, canary, or rolling update, they all happen the same way at the pod level. The pod is asked to shut down by Kubernetes. When Kubernetes does that, it will no longer send new connections through the service or the load balancer. It will start sending those to the new pods, which is why it spins up a new pod first. So it spins up a new pod, deploys, it starts sending new connections, but existing connections are still talking to your old pods. You have to be able to tell your application, hey, you've just received a SIGINT, which means you need to shut down gracefully, which means you need to know about all your users that are currently connected, and you need to give them a signal to reconnect, which will then reconnect them to the new pod. This is a common thing in HTTP, but most developers don't focus on that. They don't pay attention to it. So be one of the better ones, be one of the good ones, and go learn that stuff. I talk about it a lot. Other people talk a lot about it. And then you'll know exactly how your apps shut down, and you can feel confident that when you're doing a rolling update, which is, in this regard, it's the same as Blue-Green. Blue-Green just does it all at once, whereas rolling update does it one pod at a time. But it's the same problem. Blue-Green is going to spin up both sides at the same time are going to be running. And it's really up to the load balancers and the services for where the connections go. And they have to know when you're done with the connections on a certain pod in order to shut it down, or in order to shift it over. Because you don't want to force a connection from the server end, because then that might interrupt a user download or upload, and that'll be a bad experience for your customers. Anyway, I'm sure that gets a bunch of chat in here, but that's a really powerful thing that once you learn that stuff, it's not even really a Kubernetes thing. It's just swapping out one version of your app for another. That's the standard. We've been dealing with this for decades, ever since we all had the internet and had to keep things always on. So Kubernetes just makes it easier, but you still have to know how your apps behave. My purpose for my question was, why Terraform? Why not CloudFormation? Well, CloudFormation is only AWS. So if you want to ever use another cloud, you would want to do something other than CloudFormation. And Terraform does a lot that CloudFormation doesn't, right? Terraform has all these third-party modules that aren't AWS services. And so you can add other things into Terraform. Maybe you're running stuff on an EC2 instance, and it's not a CloudFormation thing, because it's something you're running custom on a host. And so Terraform can help you with that. That's why a lot of people, most that I see, they use Terraform and Ansible. The only time they would use Ansible is if they have to deploy servers that they have to install software on. If you don't need to install software on servers, you can avoid Ansible and just use Terraform, because Terraform is really focused on deploying infrastructure and then changing the infrastructure. But SSHing into a bunch of nodes and then making sure the same packages are there, that's more of something that you would do in Ansible. So that's what I see people using. CloudFormation is great if you only ever in your life plan to use AWS services. But in the background, the reality is that most of us are doing something at least a little bit outside of AWS, and we might also be deploying stuff on AWS that we want to control through Terraform. Great question, though. Best certification for Kubernetes for DevOps guy. Well, first off, get your DevOps certifications. Whatever your cloud of choice is, go get their DevOps. They all have one. All the big three have DevOps-oriented certifications. So get your cloud certifications. Then go get a Linux certification. Then go get a networking certification. Maybe you do Linux before networking, maybe networking before Linux. And then go get your Kubernetes certification. The Certified Kubernetes Administrator. That's the first one. If you're trying to be a kube admin, if you're trying to be a cluster deployment expert, you're going to want to get the CKA. So, but you don't do that on its own, right? Because when I look at a Kubernetes admin, I expect that Kubernetes admin to understand Linux, because you're managing Linux, you're administrating Linux, and then everything in Kubernetes is networking. So if you don't have solid networking fundamentals, if you don't know the answer to which layer of the OCI model does a router operate on, and which layer does a switch run on, and which layer does HTTP run on, if you don't know the answer to those questions, or the question, what's the answer to what's the difference between a router and a switch, or what's a standard packet size for TCP packets on the internet. If you don't know some of these things, then you need to go back to your networking, because eventually Kubernetes troubleshooting is really a lot of networking troubleshooting a lot of times. and you're going to need to know some of these concepts. What's a virtual interface, right? What is IP tables in Linux? These are all things that as a kube admin, I have to deal with. So when I look for people, if I was to hire you, I wouldn't actually be that concerned if you didn't have a Kubernetes admin certification. What I'd be looking for is those strong fundamentals of the operating system, the network, and the clouds. Those to me are more important than whatever the app du jour is of the day, right? Kubernetes is the highest thing. If you think about it, it's like networking, OS, cloud, and then finally the orchestration, right? That's just me, though. That's just me. Many people are not developers. Yes, exactly. I am not a full-time developer. I'm a full-time sysadmin and operator that happens to know a little bit about development. So my career has always been ops and sysadmin focused, and then development was always on the side. It was more of a hobby. Maybe I was doing simple programming to administrate servers or something. And then maybe I was making some apps that I just wanted to play with, right? So I work hand in hand with full-time developers all day, but I wouldn't really call myself a full-time developer. So I'm like you. So your question is, can you suggest some sample applications which can be used to build and run with Docker and make clusters via K8s? Well, my courses have plenty of sample applications. And then I would say just go on GitHub and search Kubernetes sample. Honestly, there are now a good solid dozen sample applications out there. Let me see if I can't just find you some. There's the microservices demo from the Google Cloud Platform. So let me show you that one. So this right here is from the Google Cloud Platform. It is a microservice demo, online boutique, I guess is what it's called. And it's just one of many. So if you start looking around for cloud distributed application samples, or if they're just everywhere. There's a lot of them. I think they're all useful in their own right. I don't have a favorite because it's not about just using one. It's about trying a bunch of different ones because they each have their own complexities and their own problems. So that's one. Let me see if I give you one more. A really simple one. The sock shop is a pretty common one. So this is under microservices demo / microservices demo. I'll put both these in chat. So the microservices demo from Google Cloud Platform. And then I bet you everyone in chat has their own favorite that they can recommend as well. And then here's the sock shop. Those are two. And honestly, one of my favorite things to do is to go find an old demo app that no one's giving love to anymore, and it's maybe not designed for Kubernetes, and then make it run in Kubernetes. Because you'll learn a lot in just Dockerizing an application and then making that work in Kubernetes YAML. So yeah, try those. Docker has lots of samples as well. If you look up Wordsmith, write these down if you're near a notepad or something. Wordsmith is one. Dogs versus Cats, or what is it called? The voting app is another one. I use that one. If you look in my GitHub, I have voting app several times in there. It's a very common, simple, it's not really a microservice. It's more of it's a non-monolith, non-microservice in the middle kind of thing. So yeah. Thoughts on Istio? Yeah, I mean, it's great. People use it all the time. I find it a little bit more complex, and I prefer something a little simpler. I don't normally deploy service mesh on my clusters unless they become very large and very complex, and I have a lot of web services. So so service mesh to me is an optional component that once your team gets big enough and advanced enough, and you know all the other things already, like you understand ingress well, you understand proxies well, and you want to add that, because it does add a layer of complexity, so you have to have the free time to manage it, and it can totally ruin if you don't do it right, it's in between all the parts of your app, and it can really mess with things. So you definitely want to spend some time with it. But I find things like traffic mesh simpler because that's one proxy per node. It's just a simpler model. Glue has been around a long time too, so I like the glue mesh offering. So, yeah. How important is it to understand the code base when building and setting up CI/CD pipelines to deploy applications as containerized applications? I don't necessarily know the code base. What I know is the package manager. That's probably one of the most important things. If you're a build engineer, meaning that you're managing the builds of the app, which now includes the container image. If you're that kind of person, you could actually know nothing about what the app really does. But you're going to be looking at two things in the app. The package dependencies that it has, because if you're going to be building the Docker file, you're going to have to know all the dependencies. And that means you should know the package manager for that app. So you should understand how it works. How do you lock versions of things in the package manager? How do you tell the difference between dev dependencies and production dependencies? Because you shouldn't have the dev dependencies in production. So you have to know how that works. And so every package manager is different. So I would say learn each one of those for your team's apps. That's the first one. And the second one is learning the configuration and how does that application or that framework that you're using typically get configured. How do you use environment variables? Is it a JSON file? Is it a language specific file that has to be set up? Hopefully it's environment variables, but you're going to need to learn that as well. So the two things that control your app in a container are its configuration and then also its dependencies. So yeah, you could know nothing about the language itself or exactly what it's doing, and you just need to know those two things. That's a great question, actually. Hey, Chief. Hey, what's up? GitHub Actions versus Jenkins. I do not like Jenkins. I have no love for it. I will never use it again if I can get away with it. I do not deploy it. I do not recommend it in any situation. There are simply way better tools nowadays. I love GitHub Actions. It is my preferred solution of choice. It is way less complex. I don't have to run the infrastructure. I can opt to have a lot of my things run in the cloud. And even if I have very secure infrastructure, I can choose for only parts of my GitHub Actions to run there. And then the rest of it just runs for free in the public cloud. For example, I'll lint in the public cloud because it's just linting. But if I need to test on my infrastructure in my data center, I can spin up GitHub Action runners, which will do the work for me through GitHub Actions. I mean, it's the same model as Jenkins. You have Jenkins workers as well. But I don't want to run the complex, archaic, horrible UI experience of Jenkins. I've just grown to hate it compared to everything else out there. What I want a solution that has been invented since the dawn of containers. So less than 10 years old, preferably less than 6 years old. And so if you think of things like Drone, that's an open source project that started around the time of containers because of containers. Now, I'm not a big fan of Drone anymore either because mostly it's gotten pretty stale in my opinion and it hasn't really evolved as fast as it needed to. But it's a free open source alternative. GitLab has another great alternative that I think is way better than Jenkins. So maybe look at that if you need an on-prem solution or GitHub Enterprise, which runs on-prem as well. So those are my preferences. I use Circle CI on... I used to use Circle CI more before GitHub Actions, but now that GitHub Actions has matured a bunch, I use it in every case rather than using Circle CI. So that's just me, though. Any recommendation for solutions of encryption of pod-to-pod and node-to-node traffic? That's what Service Mesh can use. So two things you can do there. If you need wire-level encryption, then you should be looking at a network, a CNI, that provides that functionality and provides network policy to protect your pods from not talking to the other pods that you don't want it to talk to. That's all network policy at the CNI level. So you would be looking at CNI plugins like Selenium or not Selenium, sorry. Now that I've said it, like CNI plugins. So there's a list. It's a huge list. I don't have to think of it because I can just scroll through the list. So if you go to if you just search CNI plugins, they'll have this big old list somewhere. I don't know if this is actually the page with the list. Yeah. Nope, that's not it. There's a page on here that lists them. Networking provider. There we go. So if you look at all these CNI providers, Calico and Cilium were the two I was trying to pull out. Calico is a very common one. Cilium is another very common one. There are tons of options here. They all have different features. And then on top of that, if you need to do HTTPS level encryption between all your pods, maybe you don't want wire level encryption, you want application level encryption, and more importantly, authentication, that kind of thing, you can look at a service mesh. A service mesh, that's one of the features of most service meshes, is to do that at the application protocol level, whereas the CNI is operating way down at low levels at the TCP level, down there. So I would recommend that. Hopefully that helps. Do Kubernetes admins need to learn Golang? No. Nope. Not at all. You can operate Kubernetes as an admin for years without necessarily knowing Go. Yes, I hate Jenkins. So, yeah. Tekton versus GitLab. I don't have a lot of experience with Tekton. GitLab, I have a slight amount of experience with. Neither one of them I would consider myself an expert on, so I'm not going to be able to give you a choice on both of them. I feel like the thing with GitLab is that it's more comprehensive, right? Because it's a code storage, it's a DevOps automation tool, it does all these things. Tekton's very focused on parts of those automations, right? So you might even argue that you could use them together, but I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to say much more than that. Yeah, ADO, Tanner is fine. ADO is fine. I have a company that's using ADO, Azure DevOps now, and I'm trying to get them on GitHub Actions because I think that eventually GitHub Actions will try to have like 80% features or 90% features of Azure DevOps. Like basically, it doesn't always make a lot of sense for all that stuff to be redundant across both. And I get it that there's people in Azure that don't use GitHub, and there's people in GitHub that don't use Azure. So they do have to have probably two different solutions. But there's been rumors going around about DevOps demise for a while now, and I don't really know if I believe them. But if you're happy with the solution, it doesn't really matter what you're using. If you're happy and it solves the business problems, that's what's key. If it's not repetitive and requiring a lot of toil, right? That's one of the things that we try to avoid in DevOps is toil. That's the thing that you have to keep doing over and over that you could probably automate. So always automate. If you find an automation solution that you like, just do that. But if you spend a whole lot of time managing the automation solution, then it's kind of not meeting the goal of not needing a bunch of humans to manage it. So that would be how I describe Jenkins. So I prefer now with my automation tools to get them as close to the code as possible, the code repo, so that my developers can see all the actions, all the things that are happening with their code, all in real time, right where they live with their code. So whether it's Bitbucket or wherever you're storing your code, I always try to prefer that for as much automation as I can do. Now, I'm not going to have all my automation there. I might have some automation in Zapier, right? In that sort of WYSIWYG approach because it's easier to use. Or I might have some automation technically in cluster. Maybe I'm using Crossplane or, for very specific things. But I'm probably going to do a lot of the bulk automation right next to my code. Testing the code, building the Docker images, linting the code. I'm going to always try to get that as close to code as possible. And then depending on my environments and the requirements, I might use an additional tool somewhere else. Yeah, Calico. That's okay. So we're gonna wrap this up. I've been talking for 2 hours now. My voice is a little sore. So, by the way, I do this once a month. You can come back once a month for this pure Q&A. The rest of the weeks, every month, I have guests, and we talk about Docker and Kubernetes topics all the time. and all the things DevOps containers. And this once a month I do this Q&A only. It's always on Thursdays. We do it at the same time every Thursday. So make sure you come back, like and subscribe, all those things. And then if you're curious, you can get on my Patreon and I will give you a weekly update on all the stuff I'm creating. So in case you haven't seen it, for those of you that just joined, Patreon/Bret Fisher. That is where you can get me. You don't have to give me any money. Simply scroll down, click the follow button. You get a weekly email of just the new stuff I'm creating every week. The podcast, the live show, which you're watching right now, all the open source on GitHub, that's all there. So I'm going to pick these last two questions, and then I'm going to see if I can get them wrapped up pretty quickly. So Nicholas is asking, what's the best way nowadays to be up to date with cutting edge tech? Honestly, I think it's very individual, but podcasts, newsletters, right? I don't spend a lot of time in forums honestly, my Discord server, I learned so much from our Discord server, right? Oh, right there. That's the Discord server. I learned a ton there because there's people in there talking about stuff every day, sharing news. There's people constantly sharing, you know who you are, the whole crew that's always there all the time, sharing their stuff. And so we've built a community there. Again, over 10,000 people. And so there's that. But for more formal, I'm always listening to podcasts. The Kubernetes official podcast from Google is great. I have a podcast. There's plenty of other great podcasts. I listen to those. And that's just because when I'm driving or running errands or washing the dishes, I can listen to those podcasts. And then I don't make much time for newsletters, but find newsletters. Like there's so many out there. I don't really even have a list anymore because I just don't make a lot of time for them. But there's a lot of great tech newsletters. If you just kind of poke around, you'll look around, you'll find them pretty quickly, and you'll find which ones suck and which ones you like. Because you might like really long ones that are really on a very focused topic, or you might prefer something like DevOps-ish, which hasn't been around a while, but DevOps-ish is run by Chris Short, and he's got a great one over here that he spun it back up, and I'm for some reason not seeing him. But Chris Short has a website, DevOps-ish, and it's a summary. It sort of summarizes the news of the week, and it's a great summary email in the DevOps world. It's totally free, but you can check that out. That's maybe the one I would recommend. And then if you're an engineering manager and you happen to manage people, Laura Taco, Tacho, Laura Taco has a great engineering management newsletter. So there's that. All right, what's the last question here? Ram Krishna's question on DevOps certifications are necessary for a developer. No. It just depends on whether you want, how competitive do you want to be? Very few developers that I know have DevOps certs. Very few. So if you go get one, you're going to have a certification they don't have, which makes you more competitive. So I would say you don't have to, but why not? Maybe just go get a cloud DevOps certification for the cloud that your team uses or your company uses, and just get that one. And that's all you need, really. You don't have to go to like the DevOps Institute and go through their whole huge certification program. You don't have to do that. How to keep containers. Okay, this is the last question. And thanks, Martin. Thanks for the great show. Ruslan, how to keep containers permissions in sync with the machine permissions when I'm developing in the container. Well, that's a tricky one, because if you're using Docker Desktop and you're bind mounting, Docker Desktop just tries to solve that permissions problem for you. So the way to keep them in sync is to make sure you're testing, and that you're testing those permissions when you build the images. So when you do a copy command in your Docker file, make sure that you're doing the --chown, and you can also do a --chmod if you're talking about like executables. But you can do those in your copy commands in your Docker file, which would change the permissions when they're being copied in, so that they're always consistent in the container. So that's maybe the one thing that I would make sure you have if you don't have that. And hopefully that helps. All right, everyone. Thanks again so much for the show. We are having A great time here, but I'm quickly losing my voice and I've got to go. So for those of you watching, again, every Thursday, and if you're not able to join on Thursdays, that's okay. You can watch it later, or you can get the recap in the podcast. The podcast that comes out every other Friday is the best of my shows, shortened down. It doesn't have any of the demos, so you're going to miss the demos, but it has just the information about some new tool that we're all using or the latest Kubernetes features or whatever. So that's a show every Thursday here on my YouTube Live. So please subscribe and check out my Patreon if you want to support me in my open source. Thank you, everyone. Have a good time.